20th century, it seems that there is a recurring pattern when it comes to the position of Latin in American high schools and the reaction of classicists and Latin teachers whenever they believe themselves to be threatened by the rise of other subjects in the curriculum or the demands of the time. For this presentation, I will briefly survey some of the key moments that demonstrate this trend and conclude with a few thoughts on the state of Latin today. I will start with the position of Latin in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. At this time, Latin experienced great increases in enrollment, both because high school enrollments were on the rise in general, and because Latin was still a requirement for most colleges and universities. However, even when Latin was being taken by nearly half of all students in the year 1900, classicists already were becoming anxious about their subject and expressed their desire to maintain Latin's status and extend its vogue. They first felt themselves threatened by the introduction of more subjects into the curriculum, including English, modern languages, and sciences, as well as what they describe as the wearisome and wasteful practical subjects, such as manual training, woodworking, and typing. The study of Latin is also starting to be criticized to greater effect than in previous centuries, especially during and following World War I. Some of the arguments made by opponents of classical languages, such as these shown here, include that they also recommended substantial reductions to the amount of reading previously required of students, which many teachers complained was just impossible to get through. They even encouraged the practice of speaking Latin aloud and promoted the reading method, which involves comprehending the Latin in Latin order over the analytical, puzzle-like grammar translation method, which is a debate that is still widely discussed today. While some teachers were surprised by the revolutionary proposals of the investigation, many wholeheartedly supported its findings and used it as a teacher's handbook. The College Entrance Examination Board also unanimously approved its recommendations in 1929, and so abolished requirements for the amount of Latin to be read, and instead encouraged more freedom of choice in reading material. Building on the investigation, Latin teachers published additional handbooks and new textbooks throughout the 1930s, with further recommendations to improve the teaching of Latin. They especially began working to ensure that students were motivated by interest in the subject, rather than only by the skills they were told they could gain. For this reason, teachers were urged to be more merciful and not demand so much from their students. They were also encouraged to work closely with other departments to form connections between subjects and to adapt classical readings to make them more in line with students' comprehension levels. Textbooks in general were greatly improved to include more interesting readings and a far greater amount of illustrative material. Teachers were even asked to allow students to read and write about topics more related to their own experiences and interests, including through the use of riddles, jokes, plays, student pranks, cartoons, songs, and games. New technologies were always being immediately adopted, such as slide projectors, film screenings of Julius Caesar or Spartacus, and recordings of spoken Latin. Crucially, however, such efforts to enliven Latin classes were also purported to serve the wider Latin cause, advertising the department to other students, parents, administrators, and the community by showcasing student projects and performances. Many more Latin clubs and activities began to be held, which included banquets, chariot races, and costume parties. Starting in the 1940s, an annual nationwide Latin Week began to be celebrated by schools as an outreach project, which involved similar events and activities. Many of the changes made by Latin teachers in the 1930s to make the study of Latin more enjoyable and cultural were also part of an effort to adapt and adopt their teaching to the educational trend of the time towards the social studies, such as civics, sociology, and politics, which were becoming more popular in schools and were seen as another threat to the status of Latin and many other foreign languages, allying them together in a common cause. However, during World War II, Latin teachers then saw themselves threatened by the increase of war preparatory, science, and technical classes, and so completely reversed their position back to emphasizing the discipline, precision, and difficulty of Latin once again, in order to align the subject with the war effort. It is at this time that arguments for Latin on the basis of developing an understanding and appreciation of the concept of Western civilization become especially prominent as well, because it was believed that if citizens were more knowledgeable about the origins of their culture, they would be more willing to fight to defend it. Unfortunately, such arguments, and even others that also appear at this time, in favor of tolerating racial differences on the basis of colorblind merit, are still used today by white supremacists to promote racist ideologies. Finally, Latin enrollments sharply declined in the mid-60s and 1970s because of a number of factors, including a renewed interest in math and science during the space race, general disillusionment with traditional institutions during the Vietnam War and Watergate scandal, and a demand for relevant courses, which led many colleges and universities to lessen or drop their language requirements. Once more, Latin teachers and classicists rallied in support of their subject, both reiterating all the old arguments for Latin's usefulness in developing vocabulary, critical thinking skills, and a knowledge of literary tradition, and again resolving to discard old teaching methods and develop new ones. Similar to the 1930s, teachers attempted to promote different approaches, such as reading, linguistic, and direct methods in teaching Latin, over the grammar translation method. They also worked to connect the study of Latin even more closely to English. When enrollments rose once more in the 80s and 90s, steps were also finally made to make Latin more inclusive to people, students of color, women, and students with learning disabilities, as new methods and programs were developed, and depictions of slavery and female characters in textbooks began to be analyzed and criticized. As for today, while Latin and classical studies are sadly still used by some as a means of oppression and exclusion, many Latin teachers are working actively to resist racist, sexist, and homophobic ideologies and make the classics a more welcoming space. Teachers now argue that calling classics universal lacks a critical perspective, and that teachers should no longer insist upon mastery or act as all-knowing experts in the classroom, and that Latin should not be held up as superior to other subjects. Instead, teachers are working to ensure that their students feel respected, supported, and valued, and have begun experimenting with traditional grading practices to make Latin class a safe place to make mistakes. Latin teachers are also now working to interrogate the text they read, rather than encouraging the adoption of Roman moral, social, and civic values, as was often the case in the past. I think that if these techniques are adopted by teachers, the learning of Latin can be a beneficial and confidence-building learning experience.
And that's